Hello, it's Father Norm Douglas. I haven't given a video like this for a couple months, but I wanted to convey something of some of my feelings that many of you may connect with because this weekend we are remembering 20 years since 9/11. For that, it's a deeper emotional connection for me. Obviously not the same as those who've lost loved ones there or those who were first responders in all those various places where people lost their lives. For me, it comes down to a year after 9/11, actually in September 11th of 2002, being in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Now, many of you may or may not know that that's exactly where Flight 93 went down. And we've heard the story, these brave patriots in that plane who had heard about what had happened to the other sites and were aware that that plane was aimed for Washington, D.C., and very well for the Capitol or the White House. And for them, they recognized they needed to do something. We often call them the first patriots of dealing with terrorism. They knew that somehow they had to get into that cockpit and stop those people from aiming for DC. They also knew their own lives were obviously at great jeopardy, and yet they put their focus on what they could do to stop this. And of course, they did stop it. Unfortunately, sadly, the plane went down in a grassy field in Pennsylvania, in Shanksville area. And there was their last giving of themselves completely. Now, for me, how I got involved in all of this was that a woman from the Akron area, her name is Sharon Dietrich, and Sharon has raised a lot of money for the memorial of that in Shanksville. But first year, when she was going to go and she heard that the people needed in that particular area somebody who could help them plan the 1-year anniversary event, because they knew that certainly President Bush and Laura Bush were going to be there. They knew other things were happening. And so Sharon did a lot with some others to get all that put together for that year one. She asked me to come to that event, actually the night before, and the reason she felt it would be good to have a clergy there, especially a clergy in a collar that would be recognized in that way as a religious leader. She knew that it was valuable, and they had, grief counselors and so forth there. These were the people 1 year after the 40 people died in being heroic and bringing down Flight 93, that now these were their families, their survivors, coming in a year's time, meeting some of each other for the first time, and reliving in some way this experience, and certainly reaching out to one another because each of them better understood what the other was going through because of their own tragic loss. Now, what happened was the night before the celebration's a bad word, the night before the commemoration, remembering and going down to the place where that plane went down. The night before, they were having in one of the area places, bringing together the family members to have an evening the night before to remember their loved ones. And if any of them wanted to commemorate, to remember them in some significant way, which meant a whole lot, even though it was painful. And so one person did a piano piece remembering his daughter. Somebody else did a PowerPoint. Somebody else sang a song. Somebody else read a poem. Somebody else read a letter. So a number of different people were remembered. It was powerful to listen to, and it was also painful. I know for me that just trying to be open to listening to them, and what Sharon, the one who put this together, asked me to do was when this dinner was over, and it was over probably around 9:30, that if I would be standing outside in the lobby and be there as a priest and be open to anybody who maybe wanted to talk to me, maybe wanted to share some of their feelings, their pain, their hope, their memories of their loved one, that I would be there for that. And as she told them, I would be there that evening through whatever hours it took. The reality was that I listened to some people. That was most important, wasn't it? They didn't need me to lecture. They didn't need me to pontificate. They didn't need me to be real preachy, but they needed me to be there and somehow listen and accompany them for that time in sharing this story. And you know, the reality is we all have stories to share. And in every one of our lives, sometimes those stories can be painful. We've all probably experienced some grief. And the ability to be able to have somebody that we could talk to, that would listen, that would seek to understand, maybe not fully, because we can't fully understand the grief of another person, but simply to be there, to be open. And that's what I was. And that night, I listened to several people through the course of the night before the next morning when they had a memorial and President Bush and Mrs. Bush came there and they were all gathered there. But just to share with you a few of the stories I heard only briefly. One was the story of a man. In fact, I saw him the next morning, and this is when this event took place. I was able to go into that area where the plane had gone down with the families. And when I was there, a lot of them got to know me from the stories that we heard the night before. One fella, when he got to that charred area, the very first thing he did was bend over and kiss the ground. He came up with tears in his eyes saying, "This was as close as I get to my wife's physical presence." Can you imagine that? But it was powerful. It was sad, and yet it was also touching, and he felt he had at least some contact with her that meant something to him. The night before, I heard other stories, just a couple I'll mention briefly. One was a fellow who thought his wife, who was a flight attendant on one of the planes, he thought she was okay, that she wasn't on one of those flights. But at the last minute, she changed with somebody else who wanted to change with her, and she was on the doomed flight. And he didn't know that, so he just listened and thought, she's okay, she wasn't on that flight. But later in the afternoon, probably around 3 in the afternoon, he got the word that she had been on there and that she had died. Obviously, he was mortified. He just, as he shared his story with me, you could just see a year later all the emotion come back up. But we talked, and because he was talking to me as a man of faith, and what did that mean? And for him, he mentioned when he realized that she had died, he was going down the steps of his New York apartment, and he was going to go to the neighborhood bar just to have a drink and somehow be with people he knew there. Well, on his way down, his pastor was on his way up. He heard the news also, and his pastor, Catholic priest, talked to him, and this fella said, "Hey, get out of my way, pastor. I'm going to go drink. I'm going to go one place I can go where there's community, to the bar." And the pastor said, "You know what? I'm going with you." And so this fellow talking to me a year later said how much that meant. His pastor didn't try to preach to him, didn't try to soothe him in any particular religious stories, but said, "Hey, I'll go with you wherever you are." And that's what the pastor did. And this fellow sharing meant that so much to him. And then when eventually, within a few days, they buried his wife, that pastor was there. And again, he was reminded, as painful, as awful as he was, that his pastor became a symbol for him, that our God is somebody through human beings in our life that wants to walk with us, whatever we endure, and believe he's there to help. Finally, one more quick story. There was a fellow who at the dinner talked about the reality that his daughter had gone back to college in California. That's why she was on the plane. And in that college, she was somebody who was trying to bring people together, foster peoples of different nations and races and religions coming together and better understand one another. And he said when he heard that she died, he was understandably furious, heartbroken. Here she was trying to do good, and she was a victim of hate. But that was not the rest of the story. He carried that hate for people in Afghanistan for 6 months, and then eventually he was able to hear his own daughter in a spiritual way speak to him and say, "Dad, you know, I can understand your hate, but you know what? We need to bring people together more than ever." And so this man who had hate in his heart for the people in Afghanistan, he was turned around by hearing his daughter speak to his heart and soul. And from that time on, he began to raise money for orphans in Afghanistan that they could get the help they needed and the kind of community support and whatever orphanages they could be in that would really help them. He raised the money because he said, "This is what my daughter would really want. She'd want me just not to add more hate, but to show active concern and care for the Afghanistan people," which he did. Wow. Just hearing these stories, there's so much more I could share, but I know I've talked enough here. But as we go forward, we remember this is about real people. And in a time after 9/11, where this country came together with all our differences, we're reminded now, where we still have a lot of division and some of that is hostile, that the goal of all of us and the goal of any of us with any faith or perspective we have is that this God wants to bring us together. And this God, certainly in the Christian tradition, and I'm sure in others too, wants to remind us that hate and struggle and suffering and death and terrorism do not have the final say. Love and goodness, and a promise that love is stronger than death, and that there is a life that can take us beyond, in which there's no more hate, but only sharing the goodness of being one. So, good thing to reflect on today. Thanks for listening. I've gone a little longer. May God bless you all.